What just happened in a New York courtroom changed everything, because Attorney General Pam Bondi walked into what she thought would be a routine legal proceeding. And she walked out exposed. The person who did the exposing was New York Attorney General Letitia James. And the lies she caught Bondi in weren't small inconsistencies. They were documented contradictions that unraveled an entire defense strategy in real time. This wasn't a political hearing, this was a court of law, where lying has consequences. And Pam Bondi just discovered what those consequences look like when someone has the receipts. The case involves the Trump Organization, financial records, property valuations, complex fraud allegations that Letitia James has been building for years. But this particular court session wasn't about Trump directly. It was about whether Pam Bondi, as the current Attorney General of the United States, had standing to intervene in a state-level prosecution. Bondi's legal team filed motions claiming the case against Trump's business was politically motivated, that it violated federal interests, that the Department of Justice needed to step in and stop New York from proceeding. Standard legal maneuvering. Except Letitia James had been waiting for this moment. She knew Bondi would make certain claims. She knew what arguments the DOJ would present, and she had prepared an evidentiary trap that Bondi walked straight into. The hearing started normally. Bondi's lawyers argued that the Trump Organization case was an overreach of state authority, that it interfered with federal investigations, that the timing was suspicious, that the entire prosecution was tainted by political bias. They presented their case confidently, professional, detailed. Then Letitia James stood up, and she did something Bondi clearly didn't expect. She presented documents, not legal arguments, documents. The first document was a letter written by Pam Bondi to the New York Attorney General's office, dated 3 years ago, before Bondi became Trump's Attorney General. In that letter, Bondi, as a private citizen and former Florida Attorney General, praised the New York investigation into Trump's finances. She called it necessary. She said financial fraud of this scale required aggressive prosecution. She commended Letitia James for pursuing it. The letter was on official letterhead. It was signed. It was undeniable. Letitia James read portions of it aloud in court. Every sentence contradicted what Bondi's lawyers had just argued. If the case was politically motivated, why did Bondi support it before she worked for Trump? If it was an overreach, why did she call it necessary? If the evidence was weak, why did she commend the investigation? Bondi's legal team tried to object. The judge allowed the evidence. It was a public letter. It was relevant to the question of Bondi's credibility and standing. James continued. She presented the second document, an email, sent from Pam Bondi to a conservative legal foundation. In the email, Bondi discussed strategies for defending Trump after she was appointed Attorney General. She outlined which cases she would try to kill, which prosecutors she would try to discredit, and specifically mentioned the New York financial fraud case as a priority target. The email was dated 2 weeks before Bondi filed her motion to intervene. It proved premeditation. It showed that Bondi's legal arguments about federal interests and prosecutorial overreach were pretexts. The real motivation was protecting Trump. Letitia James had the email because it was produced in discovery in a separate ethics complaint. Bondi's team hadn't expected it to surface here, but James had done her homework. She knew every piece of relevant evidence, and she was using it surgically. The courtroom went silent. Bondi's lawyers scrambled. They tried to argue the email was taken out of context. They tried to claim attorney-client privilege. The judge shut them down. The email was sent to a third-party legal foundation. There was no privilege, and the context made it worse, not better. But Letitia James wasn't done. She presented a third document, a deposition transcript, from a case Bondi was involved in as Florida Attorney General. In that deposition, Bondi testified under oath about the standards for prosecuting financial fraud. She laid out detailed criteria. She explained how property valuations work in fraud cases. She described the evidence needed to prove fraudulent intent. Everything she said in that old deposition directly supported the legal theory Letitia James was using in the Trump Organization case. Bondi had literally provided the prosecutorial blueprint, and now she was in court trying to argue that same blueprint was invalid. James walked through the transcript point by point. She showed how Bondi's own sworn testimony contradicted every argument her current legal team was making. The judge asked Bondi's lawyers directly, "How do you reconcile your client's prior sworn statements with your current position?" They had no good answer. They claimed Bondi's views had evolved. They said the cases were different. They argued the legal standards had changed. None of it held up. The law hadn't changed. The fraud statutes were the same. The valuation methodologies were identical. The only thing that changed was Bondi's client. Then Letitia James delivered the final blow. She presented financial records, showing payments made to Pam Bondi by Trump-affiliated entities, speaking fees, consulting contracts, legal retainers, all dated between the time Bondi left office in Florida and when she was appointed U.S. Attorney General. The amounts were significant, over $2 million across various agreements, and every single payment came from businesses connected to the Trump Organization or Trump family members. James argued this created a direct financial conflict of interest, that Bondi was not an impartial federal law enforcement officer, that she was a paid advocate for the very entities under investigation, and that her motion to intervene should be denied on those grounds alone. Bondi's team tried to claim the payments were legitimate legal fees, that Bondi had provided real services, that there was no quid pro quo. But the optics were devastating. The Attorney General of the United States had received millions from the defendants' companies, and now she was trying to shut down the prosecution of those same companies. The judge asked pointed questions. What services did you provide for these payments? Bondi's lawyers said they would need to review the contracts. The judge asked when the contracts were signed. They didn't have the dates immediately available. The judge asked if Bondi had disclosed these payments when she was confirmed. Awkward silence. The answer appeared to be no. At least not completely. Letitia James pounced. She presented the Senate confirmation hearing transcript, where Bondi was asked directly about financial relationships with Trump entities. Bondi had answered that she had no current financial relationships. Technically true, but the payments had ended only months before her confirmation, and she hadn't disclosed the total amount she'd received in the prior 3 years. It was either a lie by omission or a deliberately misleading answer. Either way, it undermined her credibility. The hearing was supposed to last 2 hours. It went 4. And by the end, Pam Bondi's legal position was in ruins. The judge didn't rule from the bench, but the direction was clear. Bondi's motion to intervene would likely be denied, and the ruling would include findings about her credibility, about her conflicts of interest, about her contradictory statements. Those findings would become part of the permanent court record. They could be cited in other cases. They could be used in ethics complaints. They could follow Bondi for the rest of her career. But the damage went beyond this one case, because everything that happened in that courtroom was public record. Journalists were present. The transcripts would be available, and the story of how Letitia James systematically destroyed Bondi's credibility with her own words would spread fast. The legal community started analyzing it immediately. Former prosecutors called it one of the most effective evidentiary ambushes they'd ever seen. Law professors were already using it as a teaching example of how to impeach a witness with prior inconsistent statements. Ethics experts said the financial disclosure issues alone could trigger a DOJ Inspector General investigation into whether Bondi committed perjury during her confirmation process. Bondi tried to control the narrative afterward. She released a statement claiming the hearing was a political circus, that Letitia James was playing to the cameras, that the evidence was taken out of context. But the problem was the evidence was documentary. Letters she personally signed, emails she personally sent, testimony she personally gave under oath, financial records showing payments she personally received. There was no context that made those things go away, no spin that erased the contradictions. Conservative legal analysts tried to defend her. They argued that prosecutors change their minds all the time based on new information, that receiving legal fees for legitimate work isn't corruption, that James was just trying to embarrass Bondi for political points. But even friendly commentators had to admit the optics were terrible, and that Bondi should have anticipated these documents would surface. The question became, why didn't Bondi's legal team prepare for this? They had to know about the old letter praising the investigation. They had to know about the email discussing strategy. They had to know about the payments from Trump entities. Either they didn't do basic opposition research on their own client, or they did know and decided to proceed anyway, hoping James wouldn't have the documents. Both options reflect poorly on the legal team. If they didn't know, they're incompetent. If they knew and didn't prepare, they're reckless. Or there's a third option. They prepared Bondi for these issues, warned her the documents existed, and she decided to lie anyway. To claim she never supported the investigation, to deny the strategic nature of her intervention, to downplay the financial relationships. That would make this not a legal failure, but a personal one. A character failure, and the consequences would be more severe. Because lying to a federal judge is serious business, even if it's not technically perjury because she wasn't under oath at this particular hearing. It's still sanctionable conduct. The judge could refer her to the state bar for investigation, could recommend ethics review by the Department of Justice's own Office of Professional Responsibility, could impose financial penalties on her legal team for presenting misleading arguments to the court. More immediately, the ruling in this case would set a precedent. If Bondi's motion to intervene is denied as expected, other state prosecutions of Trump-affiliated entities would be protected from DOJ interference. New York could proceed with its case unimpeded. Georgia could proceed with its case. Other jurisdictions investigating Trump-related financial crimes would have legal cover from federal overreach. Bondi had tried to establish federal supremacy over state prosecutions, and she'd failed spectacularly. Worse, she'd created case law that would actually limit DOJ's ability to interfere in the future. The political fallout was instant and brutal. Democrats immediately called for Bondi's resignation. They cited the contradictory statements, the undisclosed payments, the apparent attempt to obstruct a legitimate state prosecution. They said she'd violated her oath of office and compromised the integrity of the Department of Justice. Republicans tried to defend her, but struggled to find firm ground. Because the evidence wasn't just allegations or accusations, it was documents, hard evidence. And documents don't care about political spin or party loyalty. Some Trump allies actually went further. They quietly blamed Bondi for bungling what should have been a straightforward legal motion. They said she'd made Trump's legal problems worse by creating negative precedent, that she'd given ammunition to prosecutors in other cases, that she'd damaged Trump's broader legal strategy through her incompetence. Trump himself was reportedly furious, not because Bondi had lied, not because she'd tried to protect him, but because she got caught, because she wasn't prepared for James's evidence, because she made him look weak and vulnerable. Sources close to Trump said he was actively considering whether to replace Bondi, that he'd lost confidence in her legal judgment and strategic thinking, that the DOJ needed someone more competent to navigate these complex legal battles. Whether that actually happens remains to be seen. But the hearing had permanently damaged Bondi's credibility as Attorney General. She could no longer credibly claim to be an impartial law enforcement official making decisions based solely on the law and facts. Every decision she makes going forward will be viewed through the lens of her financial relationships with Trump. Every prosecution she declines will be questioned as politically motivated. Every intervention she attempts will be scrutinized for conflicts of interest. Letitia James, meanwhile, had become an overnight hero to Trump critics and legal accountability advocates. She'd taken on the Attorney General of the United States in open court, and she'd won decisively, not with inflammatory rhetoric or political grandstanding, but with cold, hard evidence. She proved that Bondi had actively supported the same investigation she was now trying to kill. She showed that Bondi had received millions of dollars from Trump entities. She demonstrated